Well, good morning, everybody. It's morning for me. I don't know when you're watching this, but here we are. This lecture is going to be on theater in the early 19th century. Cassie is sitting here with me, so if you hear a meow or a purr or a snore, it's the cat. So let's get started. First of all, we are going to go to America. In fact, most of this lecture is taking place in America, pre-United States and United States. If you're wondering, but was there theater in colonial America? Yes, there was, before the 19th century. Not very much. The country was still kind of figuring itself out. City centers were just starting to grow. So there's not a ton of theatrical activity in the colonial era, but there's enough to talk a little bit about. The family that is most associated with this would be the Hallam family. They were actually English. The family was founded, I guess you could say, by William Hallam. As I said, he was English. He was active in London as an actor and producer around 1740. And he had the idea to send an acting troupe to America. So he sent his brother Louis, who, by the way, is that handsome wigged man you're looking at. So he sent Louis and his wife and a troupe of 10 other adults and 3 children to America, and they started to tour the American colonies. In 1752, they opened a theater in Williamsburg, Virginia. And this is generally considered the beginnings of professional theater in America. This was the Hallams performing in Williamsburg, Virginia. They also toured New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Just keep in mind that at this point in history, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston are the major American city centers. They're all close to water and port cities, and if anything was happening in America, it was happening in New York, Charleston, or Philadelphia. Later, the Hallam Company sailed to Jamaica in 1755, and they combined companies with another man by the name of David Douglas. Unfortunately, Louis Hallam died. Luckily, David Douglas was around to marry the widow, Mrs. Louis Hallam, and they continued to tour. They went back to the American colonies in 1758, continued touring there. And they actually ended up building 2 of the earliest American theaters. One is the Southwark Theater in Philadelphia, and that was built in 1766. If you're wondering about the pronunciation here, Southwark, which looks like Southwark, is an area in London, and it is pronounced Southwark. So since this was an English family, it is quite likely that they would have pronounced it Southwark, not Southwark. And then also the John Street Theater in New York City. Around this time, other theaters are starting to pop up. And again, the theaters are primarily going to be in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Now, interestingly, in 1775, I'm sorry, 1775, the Continental Congress banned theatrical entertainment. Remember that many of the colonists were actually of the Puritan persuasion. And theater was, along with many other forms of entertainment, considered to be, what's the word? See, this is just like being in class, you guys. Was considered to be sort of idle and useless. And there was also a desire on the part of the Continental Congress for people to sort of focus on fighting with England. And so they banned theatrical entertainment. The irony here is that they didn't actually have the power to do that because the Continental Congress was an illegal body. They were really a treasonous body, who were the first to float the idea of independence. So theatrical entertainment was sort of banned, but not really because they really didn't have that kind of power. In 1781, the ban was lifted. And from about 1790 to 1815, Philadelphia was the dominant theater city. Let's look at a couple of other theaters in America pre-United States. One is the Park Theater, which was built in New York in 1798. It was known as a place for sort of high culture. The managers, Stephen Price and Edmund Simpson, engaged British stars to play there. So touring British actors who were well known in London would come to perform there. Also, the theater featured operas and entertainment that we would call highbrow. It's very, very proper, very elitist. It didn't really have any competition at first. A little bit later, a theater that was built south of there called the Bowery Theater appealed to more working class audiences. We'll get back to working class audiences in a little bit. Two major theaters in Philadelphia. One is the Chestnut Street Theater, which was also known as the New Theater. Was built in 1805. It was conceived by a man named Thomas Wignell, who convinced a group of investors to build it for his acting company. It held about 1,200. It had proscenium doors, which was common in European theaters. So just like we have on the main stage at Stone Center, those doors that open and close that are right inside the proscenium, that was a feature of European theaters at the time. In 1816, the Chestnut Street Theater became the first American theater to use gas lighting instead of candles or oil lamps. This is a huge development. Candles and oil lamps burn very dirty. They created a lot of smoke and a lot of ash in the air. So gas lighting actually created a better environment on the lungs, but also allowed for more control over lighting. It did burn down in 1820, and it was rebuilt two more times, but eventually closed in 1918. But it really has the distinction of being the first theater to use gas lighting, so that's why it's important. Next was the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia, which was built in around 1811. It is the oldest operating theater in the United States. It is still operating. It actually started out as a circus. We'll talk about circuses in a few minutes. But started offering plays around 1812. And as I said, you can still go see a play there. All right. 19th century America in general, and we're talking early 19th century at this point. As I said, America is still kind of trying to figure itself out. America is still a very, very new country in the early 19th century. And in terms of theater, there wasn't very much that was original to the country. The most common thing that you would see if you went to the theater uh, to see a play was you'd probably see a British import. You would see a Shakespeare or one of his contemporaries, and you'd also see English actors. Americans had a little bit of an inferiority complex about theater. In general, English or European theater was preferred. There was a sense that that was of higher quality. It had an older tradition and was just better. A minute ago, I used the word highbrow. British theater was considered highbrow. Also, an interesting thing about this time was that Shakespeare was enormously popular and with all classes. So anyone from the sort of highest member of the elite to the lowest of the working class knew their Shakespeare. This was he was just considered a playwright for all classes, and so Shakespeare plays were incredibly popular. For the most part, though, Americans liked popular, lowbrow entertainment. Nothing much has changed. Americans flocked to go to circuses, to go to museums, which were a little more exciting, I think, than some museums are today. And we'll talk about one in just a minute. Americans loved burlesque shows, which we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later in the semester. But not burlesque shows where there are strippers, but burlesque as in satires of known stories or known myths. Also plays that were considered extravaganzas, high spectacle, lots of singing, dancing, beautiful costumes, beautiful scenery, not much in terms of content. And then finally, minstrel shows, which we'll talk about in detail in just a few minutes. But in general, Americans wanted things that were just sort of fun and diverting and didn't necessarily require a lot of thought. We're going to go first to one of the leading entertainment names in the actually throughout the 19th century, Mr. P.T. Barnum. Wait, there we go. Mr. P.T. Barnum. He was an American showman and businessman. He called himself the Prince of Humbug. He really, really enjoyed entertaining and fooling people. He started out as a small business owner and moved to New York City in 1834. He was born in Connecticut. And started his entertainment career with a variety troupe called Barnum's Grand Scientific and Musical Theater. In 1841, he bought Scudder's American Museum, which he renamed after himself, so he called it Barnum's American Museum. And he used it as a platform to promote hoaxes and human curiosities, like the Fiji mermaid, which you'll see a picture of in a minute, General Tom Thumb, Siamese twins, a bearded lady, and things that we would now call sideshow attractions. He invented the sideshow. The American Museum was a very large building, and he would always change the displays to get more people in. One of the things he realized very quickly was that as people were going through the museum, they were kind of going too fast through it. And when they got to the exit, they would just leave thinking, okay, well, there's nothing else to see. So he came up with this scheme. He was sort of by accident. He put up a sign that said, "This way to egress," egress, which actually means exit. But it was such a fancy word that people misinterpreted it. And they thought this way to egress meant, hey, there's a really cool attraction just on the other side of that door. So they would go out the egress door, which was actually the exit, and be so confused that they would go back to the entrance and they would be readmitted for another entrance fee. So he tricked people into coming back into the museum and paying twice. He made a lot of money. He also, while the museum was still going, the museum lasted quite a long time. So while it was still going, he also promoted the American tour of a Swedish opera singer named Jenny Lind, who is known as the Swedish Nightingale. And he offered her $1,000 a night for 150 performances, which even today is actually not a bad sum. But one of the things that he did was he so heavily promoted her before she got to the United States that when she arrived, she was met at the New York Pier by almost 40,000 people and ended up scheduling many more concerts. Eventually, she made over $350,000, which she actually primarily gave to charity, and Barnum amassed about $500,000 on her. Try to imagine how much $500,000 is today. This is, 1850. So do some math. They both got very, very rich off of it. He also wanted to sort of change public attitudes about theater. Because so much entertainment was of the lowbrow kind, that also meant that theaters that were not presenting, say, Shakespeare shows were considered dens of evil. They were places where nobody respectable would go, and certainly not families. And he wanted to make theater sort of a family-friendly thing. And so he built a theater that he called the Moral Lecture Room. And in it, he presented plays that were family-friendly or that were sort of educational. The first one that he did was a play called The Drunkard, which was a temperance play, meaning that it was an anti-alcohol play, an anti-vice play, kind of like the social issues plays that you guys might see. Don't text and drive, don't drink and drive. This was the same sort of thing. And he also did melodramas, farces, and historical plays. To make the Shakespeare plays more family-friendly, he watered them down. And so this was one of his, I guess, contributions to 19th century theater, was just to try to bring more families in. The American Museum mysteriously burned down in 1865. It wasn't really known what caused it. Theories include the fact that he had rivals. It's also theorized that he burned it down himself to get insurance money. No one actually knows. But he rebuilt it immediately, and then it burned down again in 1868, at which point he decided to abandon it. He continued as a businessman, a politician, a writer, until finally in 1881 he was approached by James Bailey to form a circus with him, which became the Barnum and Bailey Circus, and was later sold to Ringling Brothers. So, yes, that Barnum and Bailey Circus. The leading attraction was Jumbo the Elephant. Here are some pictures from P.T. Barnum's American Museum. So what you're seeing in the upper left-hand corner is a artist rendering of the museum. It was very, very large. Next to that, some Siamese twins, a bearded lady. The Fiji mermaid, which actually turned out to be the head and torso of a monkey sewed onto the tail of a fish. it wasn't really a mermaid, although I hope you figured that out already. And then General Tom Thumb, who was the shortest person in the world, who Barnum discovered and trained as a performer, and who went on to have actually quite a long career. All right, another very popular form of entertainment in America at this time is one that has kind of a difficult past, and it's the minstrel show. Blackface minstrelsy is generally considered to be the first distinctly American theatrical form. Um, Everything else that we had, as I said, Shakespeare, ballet, opera, circuses, burlesque, and vaudeville, all came from Europe. Blackface minstrelsy was developed in America. It began as a type of show that consisted of comic skits, variety acts, dancing, and music performed by white people in blackface makeup. It lampooned black people as sort of dim-witted, lazy, buffoonish, and superstitious, but also happy-go-lucky and musical. It unfortunately presented life on the plantation, the life of the slaves, as being this sort of pleasant and happy experience where everyone just sang and danced all day. And by about 1848, blackface minstrelsy was one of the most popular art forms in the United States. As you can imagine, it took a pretty big dip in popularity after the Civil War, because one of the things that happened during the Civil War was the truth really came out about what plantation life was really like, which of course was not about singing and dancing all day. But as I said, this was an extremely popular form of entertainment, and there are a couple of lasting things to come out of it that are not as offensive, or let me rephrase, that aren't offensive, although the form itself is generally considered today to be highly offensive. The basic frame of it, if you were to see one of these minstrel shows, you'd see a group of performers, anywhere from like 8 to 20. They would all be playing their own instruments, and they would sit in a semicircle. The person sitting center was a sort of MC, the master of ceremonies, and he was known as the interlocutor. And the two guys on either end were known as the end men, and they were called Tambo and Bones. Tambo played the tambourine, and Bones played a couple of chicken bones as a sort of percussive instrument. And one of the things that they would do is between songs, they would trade jokes back and forth, the interlocutor and Tambo and Bones. And they developed a form of joke telling that to us today is pretty normal, which is the setup and punchline. So usually either one of the end men would do the setup, and then the interlocutor would respond to it, and then that person would give either Tambo or Bones would give the punchline. So something along the lines of, hey, Mr. Interlocutor, why did the chicken cross the road? And the interlocutor would say, I don't know, why did the chicken cross the road? And then the person who originated the joke would give some really stupid answer to it. These jokes were usually bad jokes. They were bad puns. They might be a little bit risque. They're a huge part of the show. So there's generally sort of a 3-act structure. First, that arrangement of the group in a semicircle, playing instruments, singing songs, and exchanging jokes. The second act would usually be a sort of variety of entertainment. So you might have some songs, you might have some dances, you might have some magic tricks, you might have some scenes. And then the third act would be either a slapstick musical plantation skit or a send-up of a popular play. That was generally the outline. One of the people most associated with blackface minstrelsy is a white performer by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice, or T. Daddy Rice, who actually was performing in England. And he came up with this song and dance called Jump Jim Crow, during which he imitated what he thought a plantation slave would dance and sing. That song became so hugely popular that that name, Jim Crow, ended up being used as a pejorative, as we hear the phrase Jim Crow laws that are specifically designed to persecute or hold back African Americans. That is where that phrase comes from, is from the song Jump Jim Crow. But as I said, hugely, hugely popular. There were a couple of very well-known minstrel troupes. Two of them were Dan Emmett's Virginia Minstrels, which was formed in 1843. Dan Emmett and four other blackface performers combined to stage a minstrel concert at New York's Bowery Amphitheater. Called themselves the Virginia Minstrels, and they had a fairly long run. Also in that same year, Edwin Christie formed the Christie Minstrels, and what we're looking at is an artist's rendering of the Christie Minstrels. So as I said, there are a couple of major accomplishments to come out of minstrelsy that that eventually morphed into other forms and are no longer associated with minstrelsy. One is many of the popular dances that were done in minstrel shows became seen on much wider stages. One of which, clog dancing, was generally part of minstrel shows, which eventually became tap dancing. Which of course is better known in the musical theater world than it is for minstrelsy. Also, a lot of popular American songs were sort of born in the minstrel show. The most well-known composer of songs, and this is somebody whose songs we are still hearing today, was Stephen Foster, who lived from 1826 to 1864, and is kind of known as the father of American music. And we're talking about American popular songs. So he was primarily known as a writer for minstrel shows. He wrote over 200 songs. And some of the songs that you will know are songs like Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, The Old Folks at Home, which you probably know better as Way Down Upon the Swanee River, which, by the way, is the state song of Florida. That's right, Old Folks at Home is the state song of Florida. My Old Kentucky Home, which is the state song of Kentucky, and Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair, among many, many, many others. So minstrel shows, as I said, they took a dip in popularity after the Civil War, but one really fascinating thing happens. After the slaves are freed and many black actors are looking to break into the business, one of the things that they do is say, well, why don't we perform in minstrel shows? Because we actually know how we sing and dance, unlike these white people who are just kind of imitating us. And so many black performers went into minstrel shows. But here was the interesting thing, was that they still had to put on blackface makeup. There was something about that makeup that made them safe to the audiences. So there were many, many black performers who performed in minstrel shows but still had to put on blackface. And this was a practice that would last really into the 20th century. Believe it or not, minstrelsy actually continued to be popular, although not as popular as it had been pre-Civil War. But it continued to be popular until about 1910. And then amateur performances continued even as late into the 1960s. But in the 1950s and 60s, as the civil rights movement progressed and gained acceptance, minstrelsy sharply fell out of favor. All right, let's talk about American playwriting. The United States really didn't have a playwriting tradition, as I've already hinted at. Most of the plays that you would see in a theater would be European imports. Playwriting wasn't really considered profitable or respectable. Plays tended to be written by people who were elites who really had nothing better to do and didn't need to make money. So it'll be a little while before American playwriting starts to truly develop. But we're going to jump back in history a little bit. The first play in English that was done in the American colonies was a play called Ye Bear and Ye Cub, which translates to The Bear and the Cub, in 1665. As I said, this is the first play in English in the American colonies. The script no longer exists. We know that the play existed because a local theater official tried to ban it, and he actually took the acting company that was putting it on to court. The judge found it in favor of the acting company, so they were allowed to perform it. The earliest extant American play, so the earliest play that is still in existence, is a play written in 1715 called Androboros by Robert Hunter and Lewis Morris. This was a political satire. If you want to know more about this, my theater history professor, Peter Davis, just published a book on it. You really only want to know more about it if you're really interested in political satire, but there it is. One of the earliest popular playwrights is a man named Royal Tyler, whose name is going to come up again in a little bit. Lived from 1757 to 1826. He is best known for a play called The Contrast, which was written in 1787. And this is the first American comedy to be professionally produced. Royal Tyler also has another little claim to fame. He was engaged for a short time to John Adams's daughter, Abigail Jr., I guess. But he apparently was a jerk and kind of abusive, and she broke off the engagement. But he is considered to be the first truly American playwright. Another playwright named William Dunlap, 1766 to 1839, wrote about 60 plays. He became the sort of leading American playwright of his time. He also wrote the first history of American art. So if you are an art student or have ever been an art student, you may hear his name come up for that. The first female American playwright was a woman named Anna Cora Mowatt. She lived from 1819 to 1870. She was a writer, an actress, and a playwright. She is best known for a play called Fashion in 1845, and this was a social satire about nouveau riche Americans, so people who had just come into money, to be fashionable and cultured, and kind of failing miserably, or at least looking very silly trying to do it. This is a play that is still known and produced. And by the way, it was originally produced at the Park Theater in New York. As in terms of American playwriting, producers also really didn't want to pay untested playwrights. They knew if they did a Shakespeare that it would sell. They didn't know for sure that a William Dunlap play would sell. And so European classics tended to be safe. Also, English tragedies were much more popular than American ones. And so there was a push from a few people to create some original American nationalistic dramas using American themes and characters. So many of the early plays from this period deal with questions of national identity, the unexplored frontier, and the growing pains of this new young country. Also, melodrama was highly, highly popular. So many of these early American plays used melodrama as its sort of form. So next we're going to talk about some of those national characters. The first one, one that we would see in many plays, was known as the noble savage. So this is the Native American. These are plays about Indians that are wrestling really with questions of American identity. Indians tended to be portrayed very stereotypically, very one-sided. They were either absolute savages who would kill you in your sleep, or they were noble savages who would choose not to kill you and thus become sort of heroic. But they couldn't drop that mantle of savage. They were considered to be sort of inferior to Americans, or to white people, I should say. So the noble savage is the Indian who sort of bravely submits to the white man and retains his dignity. Best sort of identified in the play Metamora, or The Last of the Wampanoags, by John Augustus Stone. Starred an American actor named Edwin Forrest. We're going to come back to Edwin Forrest a little bit later. But this was one of his signature roles. In fact, if you look up Edwin Forrest, you'll find a lot of pictures of him playing Metamora, which is what you're looking at right now. So the noble savage is one character type that comes up again and again. The next is a character called the Stage Yankee, who, by the way, was introduced by Royal Tyler. And somewhere in the world you can get a mug that says Royal Tyler, America's first playwright. I don't know where, but if you ever find one, I want you to buy it for me, or at least buy it for yourself. So the Stage Yankee, also known as a Jonathan character, because the first time that he appears is in Royal Tyler's play The Contrast, which I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and this character is named Jonathan. This is a simplistic, down-to-earth, sort of shrewd and patriotic character. Really represents the middle class. He is sort of a country boy, so somebody who is a little bit naive, but also represents that sort of good-natured and good-hearted everyday American, not the elite. And after appearing in The Contrast, that character was so popular that he reappeared in more plays, not just ones by Royal Tyler, but by other authors. So that character became sort of known as the Stage Yankee. And by the way, that word Yankee should indicate, too, that this is somebody from the East Coast, the Upper East Coast, so not a Southerner. Another hugely popular character, particularly in New York, is the Bowery Boy. The Bowery is, at that point, is the sort of lowest point of Manhattan. It's where all the ships are coming in. It tends to be a little bit rough around the edges. In fact, sometimes incredibly rough around the edges. It could be a very dangerous area. If you ever see the movie Gangs of New York, Gangs of New York takes place in the Bowery. It's been said that it wasn't nearly as violent as Martin Scorsese shows it to be, but there it is. In any case, the Bowery was also where the lower classes tended to live, the working classes. So people who were working on the docks, people who were working in the fish markets and things like that, things that would be located by the water. So the Bowery Boy represents the urban lower classes. This particular character is a volunteer fireman. He had this very specific costume, which you're seeing on the right, this stovepipe hat, red shirt, trousers with suspenders. Again, if you watch Gangs of New York, this is what Daniel Day-Lewis looks like. But this was a character who was sort of the thug with a heart of gold. He was a volunteer fireman. Volunteer firemen tended to be sort of owned by the local political establishments. And so they would be getting a lot of money under the table. They weren't always the most reputable people, but they would always jump in and save the day. This character is best played by a man named Frank Chanfrau, who played Mose the Bowery Boy in a play called A Glance at New York in 1848. He did several more plays playing Mose. So there he is. So the Noble Savage, the Stage Yankee, and the Bowery Boy are three kind of regional, national characters that would show up in play after play after play. All right, let's talk about some actors in the 19th century. And again, we're going to kind of go back and forth between England and America for a minute. We've talked about families in scenic design. So now we're going to talk about a couple of acting families. The first is a family that hailed from London. They were hugely known in London, but also some of them toured in the United States, so they were also known in the United States. I'm sorry, I should say America. Either way. So the first one is the Kemble family. These are the 12 children of Royal. All of them went into the theater. There were three that were really the sort of the most successful, most popular. John Philip Kemble, who was the manager at Covent Garden Theater, and was very well known for his performances both at Drury Lane and Covent Garden. His sister, skip down to the end there, Sarah Kemble Siddons, who was a hugely celebrated actress in England. She was known and praised for her sort of emotional intensity. She was very good at tragic characters. In fact, the picture that you're looking at is one of her posing as the tragic muse. They're both known for a classical acting style, which was very stately, very graceful, very dignified. And they both were known for their incredible speaking voices and their emotional intensity. And then their younger brother, Charles Kemble, who was actually very interested in producing plays with historical authenticity. Up until this time period, settings and costumes were not always necessarily historically accurate. They would be accurate to the time that they were actually being performed. So one of the productions that Charles Kemble was famous for is a production of King John at Covent Garden in 1823, and he had period costumes designed for it. So the actors were not wearing essentially their street clothes, which is what they would have generally worn. But they were wearing costumes that were specifically designed for the time period that King John took place in. This was not the norm at this time. It's the norm for us now, but it wasn't in the 19th century. Very famous American acting family was the Booth family. The patriarch of the family, the father of the family, was Junius Brutus Booth, and he had two very famous actor sons, Edwin and John Wilkes. Yep, that John Wilkes Booth, the one that shot Abraham Lincoln. Of the sons, by the way, there was also a son, Junius Jr. The picture up on the right-hand corner of those three is a picture of Edwin, Junius Jr., and John Wilkes acting in, I believe, Julius Caesar. In fact, that was the only play the three of them appeared together in. So Edwin was the most successful. He was considered the foremost Shakespearean actor of his day. By the way, he lived from 1833 to 1893. He made his acting debut in 1849 and then toured the United States from 1852 to 1856. And in 1863, he leased the Winter Garden Theater in New York and gave a series of Shakespearean performances there. He did a production of Hamlet that ran for 100 consecutive performances, which was a record at that time. Plays never ran for that many consecutive performances. As I said, Edwin, John Wilkes, and Junius Jr. only appeared on stage once together in Julius Caesar. In fact, John Wilkes was quite well known for playing Brutus in Julius Caesar. And the very famous line, Sic semper tyrannis, which means thus always to tyrants, the words he yelled out after he shot Abraham Lincoln are actually from the play Julius Caesar. John Wilkes was actually a very, very popular leading man. He was considered the handsomest of the Booth brothers. He was very charismatic. He was somebody that women just swooned over. But he was also a Confederate sympathizer and was obviously not a fan of Abraham Lincoln, and in fact, for several months, schemed to kidnap him. And then finally, one night in 1865, Lincoln went to see a play. Wilkes heard about it that afternoon, heard that he was going to be there, and went to the theater with a gun, shot Abraham Lincoln. You should know that story by now. Unfortunately, it did kind of ruin Edwin's career for a while. Edwin, actually the entire Booth family distanced themselves from John Wilkes, and I have heard that to this day they still don't talk about him. His descendants still won't talk about him. Edwin did manage to continue his career, but he was severely crippled by his association with John Wilkes Booth. All right, let's talk about some more 19th century actors. Again, some of these are English, some are American. One was a man named Edmund Kean. He was an English actor, lived from 1789 to 1833. He was a Shakespearean actor. He's generally thought of as the first great romantic actor. Remember, we talked about romanticism, that sort of highly emotional, intense acting. This was the opposite of the kind of acting that the Kembles were doing. The Kembles were sort of classical and dignified actors, and Edmund Kean was a much more charismatic and intense actor. He was very good at villains and dark characters, but he was also very unstable as a person. He was an alcoholic. There's a famous quote about him. A man named Samuel Taylor Coleridge once said that to see Kean was to read Shakespeare by flashes of lightning. And for many years, that was considered to be a compliment, that Kean's acting was so exciting that it was like seeing lightning flashing in front of you. But it turns out that that might have been a dig, not a compliment, because some recent research came to light that a flash of lightning was a popular and very cheap drink that you could get at any pub. And so to say that watching him was like watching Shakespeare by flashes of lightning meant that Kean was stumbling drunk all over the stage. In any case, he was considered one of the great actors of his day, just kind of unstable. I mentioned Edwin Forrest a few minutes ago. He was known for playing the noble savage. He is really America's first great actor. He was also a Shakespearean actor. And he was also a great promoter of new American plays and playwrights. And in fact, he himself sponsored a playwriting contest to promote new American playwrights. We're going to talk about him again in just a couple minutes. In fact, when we talk about him, we're going to talk about him with William Charles Macready, who is his his great rival. So we're going to come back to him in a couple minutes as well. Ira Aldridge. Ira Aldridge was the first Black American actor. Truthfully, that's a little bit misleading. He was the first successful Black American actor. He started his career at a theater in New York called the African Grove Theater, that was founded and operated by William Alexander Brown and James Hewlett in New York in 1821. And this was the first black theater company in America. And in fact, a play that they produced in 1823 called King Shotaway was the first play written and performed entirely by African American actors. Aldridge moved to England at the age of 17 and then to Scotland. He went to school in Glasgow and toured the English provinces for 8 years. He made his debut in London playing Othello in 1833, and he also played many of the very famous leading Shakespearean roles, such as King Lear, Richard II, and Titus Andronicus. He actually ended up spending most of his career and his later life touring around Europe. He was a celebrated Shakespearean actor, and unlike in the United States, he actually could tour Europe, be recognized as a great actor, and be treated like royalty, which he often was. He would never have gotten that treatment in America. So he spent most of his career in Europe, and in fact, that was where he died. Laura Keene. Laura Keene was not just an actress, but she was also a hugely successful female manager, theater manager. In fact, she had several of her own companies. She was American, or I'm sorry, she was English, but she accepted an offer in the 1850s to move to New York City and serve as a leading lady in James William Wallach's company. But she actually wanted to have more control over her career, so she entered into theater management. So in 1853, just for a few months, she leased the Charles Street Theater in Baltimore and served as a manager, director, and performer. And then in 1855, she leased the Metropolitan Theater in New York, remodeled it, and renamed it Laura Keene's Varieties, where she also served as manager, director, and star performer for about 6 months in 1855 and 1856. She had to move when another theater manager purchased the building, and so she moved to another theater and opened Laura Keene's Theater, which operated from 1856 to 1863. She had complete control over the theater. She was the manager, she was the director, and the leading actress, and she commissioned several new shows. She tended to do the extravaganza type shows, the ones with a lot of singing and dancing and spectacle. She then decided to tour when that theater closed in 1863. Um, there was a little hiccup though. In 1865, her company performed at Ford's Theater to do a play called Our American Cousin. That would be the play that Abraham Lincoln went to and got shot at. And in fact, Laura Keene rushed up to the president's box after he was shot, and until people came to carry him across the street to get him medical help, she actually cradled his head in her lap. And apparently just was so moved by this event. Unfortunately, she also was forever associated with it. So her career had a little bit of trouble restarting after that. Everyone who was in the theater that night, everyone associated with that play, was immediately assumed to have been co-conspirators. And so it took a long time for Laura Keene's name to sort of be cleared. She had nothing to do with it. Booth acted alone. But in any case, she was one of the few women to successfully manage her own theater company in the 19th century. So she is one of the great names of that era. All right, finally, this is one of the things I love about the 19th century. Riots could happen at a theater. We don't think of this as necessarily being a thing that could happen today because theaters are not such huge places of gathering anymore. But in the 19th century, theaters were where you went for all of your entertainment, and theater goers could be so passionate that riots could occur. So there are three major ones. We already talked about one, which I'll get back to in a second. But first sort of major riot or series of riots in the 19th century were known as the Old Price riots. This occurred in 1809. Remember John Philip Kemble, who was the manager at Covent Garden? Well, in 1808, Covent Garden Theatre burned down. When he rebuilt it, he had to raise the prices to cover the building costs. And so he raised the prices and turned the third tier, which was originally was the sort of the gallery where which were actually where the cheapest seats were, turned that into private boxes and moved the gallery up higher towards the ceiling. And it was so steep and the ceiling was so low that the audience actually could only see the actors' feet because the ceiling was blocking the rest of their view. So not only was the theater less accessible to most audiences, but it was more expensive. And so the first performance when the theater reopened was Macbeth, starring John Philip Kemble. And the public rioted, demanding that he go back to the old prices, the pre-renovation prices. So that first night, a group rioted and stayed at the theater until 2 in the morning. And then they stayed for 67 more nights. The rioters called themselves the OPs, for Old Price, and they made up songs and slogans, and they would usually arrive about halfway through the show to disrupt the show. Kemble handled this very badly. And in fact, instead of trying to reason with them, he hired a boxer and his associates to handle the crowd, which led to more violence. Interestingly, these rioters considered themselves patriots because what they were advocating for was theater for everyone, not just for the rich. Eventually, Kemble caved and offered them some better price options. Of course, there were the Ernani riots, which we've already talked about, but you can review that in your notes. And then the most famous, the Astor Place riot. So the Astor Place riot was the culmination of an ongoing feud between Edwin Forrest and William Charles McCready. Edwin Forrest, I already mentioned him a few minutes ago. He was an American actor. He was born in Philadelphia, toured the western states early in his career, and realized very quickly that he felt most comfortable around the working classes. And he started to embody the sort of rough American Western spirit. And he became America's most popular Shakespearean actor. This was also the era of Andrew Jackson's presidency. For those of you who are currently in Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, this should be particularly interesting to you, because as we know, Andrew Jackson was a populist president, and he considered himself the people's president. Forrest, huge Jackson supporter, and he also embodied that sort of spirit of the people. However, Edwin Forrest did tour because most actors did. English and American actors would tour between the two countries. So he spent the 1836 season performing at Drury Lane in London, where he played Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear, and actually befriended William Charles McCready and Charles Kemble. So William Charles McCready was an English actor. He was the son of an actor. He had natural talent. He didn't really want to be an actor, but unfortunately, his father was put in jail for debt, and so McCready had to take over his father's acting company at the age of 15. In 1816, he made his debut at Covent Garden, and in 1825, he made his debut at Drury Lane. He toured the U.S. in 1843, 1844. And then returned in 1849. So here's where the rivalry starts up. So Forrest went back to London in the 1845 season. He was doing a performance of Macbeth, and somebody hissed. And at this time, if someone hissed in a theater, that was the worst thing you could possibly do. It was the worst insult to hiss at an actor while he was on stage. Forrest was led to believe that McCready was behind it. So a few weeks later, McCready is in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he's playing Hamlet. Forrest goes to see his play, and he hisses him. Well, unfortunately, that looked bad for Forrest and not McCready, and it hurt his reputation in England. So McCready tours the U.S. in 1849. And Forrest basically follows him on the tour. So as McCready is touring, a week or two after McCready had been in one location, Forrest would show up in that location and do the same roles. As I said, Forrest was very popular among the working classes. In fact, they called him our national tragedian. And at this time, there are a lot of anti-British sentiments in the working classes. The upper classes still tend to identify as British or identify with the British. The lower classes are not. They are staunchly American, new American. So I mentioned the Bowery Theater a little while ago, which is in the Bowery area, the rougher area. Forrest often performed at the Bowery Theater, so the working classes in the Bowery were huge, huge fans of Forrest. Um, the British found Forrest's acting style a little too rough, a little too American to play Shakespeare. Um, the upper classes tended to identify more with Macready and found him to be the better actor. So the riot. The Astor Place Opera House was built in 1847, and it sort of straddled the upper and working class geography of New York. It was right on the edge of the good neighborhood. And just on the other side was where the neighborhood started to get rougher. It catered specifically to wealthy patrons, and it also enforced a dress code to keep out the rowdy patrons. So in 1849, both Macready and Forrest were scheduled to perform Macbeth on the same night. Macready was going to be performing at Astor Place, and Forrest was going to be at the Broadway Theater, which is another New York theater. On May 7th, Forrest supporters bought out the balcony at Astor Place and threw rotten eggs, fruit, and potatoes and other just foul food, and even ripped out the theater seats and threw them at the stage while Macready is performing. Macready tried to continue with the show, but nobody could really hear it. And Macready sort of stomped off stage. Forrest, in the meantime, is playing Macbeth at the Broadway Theater and is getting a standing ovation. So Macready basically goes, all right, that's it. I'm done. These Americans are heathens and I'm leaving. But 47 prominent supporters of his signed a petition to ask him to stay. So he's supposed to perform again on May 10th. The police chief and the mayor suspected that there would be a riot, so they put police inside the theater, inside and outside. There were about 150 officers inside the theater and about 100 outside. So some high-ranking supporters of Forrest passed out flyers and free tickets to Astor Place, and also posted broadsides, which are basically posters, that said, "Shall Americans or English rule this city?" So that evening, about 10,000 people gathered outside the theater and actually tried to set fire to it. Most of the anti-Macready people couldn't even get in. The show went on, but Macready managed to leave the theater in disguise. At about 9:15, the crowds on the street had gotten so raucous and so violent that the militia was called out. And some soldiers shot into the air and then into the crowd. Most of the people killed were actually innocent bystanders. By the end of the evening, about 26 people were dead, over 120 were injured. And the next night, another angry mob came to protest the fact that they had been shot at. This actually marks the first time a state militia has been called out and shot into a crowd of citizens. And it also ended up leading to the creation of an armed police force. This event, this riot, changed the public perception of Shakespeare as sort of everyman entertainment. It became more associated with the upper classes. These two riots on the 10th and 11th also furthered the sort of class separation and alienation in New York and kind of symbolize what was happening all over America at the time. If you want to learn more about this, this is a really fascinating event. There's a fantastic book called The Shakespeare Riots, Revenge, Drama, and Death in 19th Century America by Nigel Cliff. So I urge you to check it out. This is one of the more polarizing events in theater history. What we see after this is a real separation of audiences, even much more so than before, and a real separation between sort of highbrow and lowbrow entertainment. And that is the early 19th century in a tiny, tiny nutshell. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Cassie has enjoyed listening to it on my lap. Please replay this lecture if you need to. Take more notes. Again, I urge you, read the book, read the book, read the book. I will be able to answer any questions that you have about any of this material when I get back. Don't miss me too much, and start studying. Thanks, everybody.